Hey y'all, before we get into today's episode, I wanted to give a quick heads up. This one is heavy. We are talking about violence against Black women in the early 1900s Atlanta, specifically murder, abuse, and the kind of erasure that still hurts today. It is hard, but it matters. That said, if this is something that you are not into the headspace to hear right now, that is totally okay. You can pause, come back later, or just skip this one entirely. Your well-being is what matters most.
Bygone Echoes.
Hello there, friends. Welcome to Bygone Echoes, a history podcast. I'm your host, Courtney, and I'm so glad that you chose to be here today. Around here, we dig up the stories that make us laugh, sometimes cry, and always remind us how the past shaped the good, the bad, and the deeply messed up things that we are still dealing with today, and how, sometimes, some things seem to never really change. This episode, it's got unsolved murders, systematic racism, some unexpected case law review, and yes, zombies. Sorta. Stay with me. Because today's story is not haunted, doll weird, or Victorian seance quirky. It's the kind of history that gets buried because it's uncomfortable. Because the people it happened to were never meant to be remembered. But not here. Here, we remember them. Picture it, Atlanta, 1911. Thick summer heat pressing against your skin. You're walking home through Pittsburgh, a Black neighborhood shaped by freed people and working class families. No streetlights, no sidewalks, just dry dirt, the crunch of gravel, and the low, eerie rumble of trains pulling past in the dark. You've heard the whispers. Another Black woman murdered. Throat slit, body left out in the open. No witnesses, no suspects, no justice. Only rumors in the Black newspapers and prayers whispered in homes. As you pass the sagging porches and laundry lines of your neighborhood, you occasionally hear another kind of violence too. Not from the shadows, but inside the homes. A slap, a scream, silence. The kind of pain the city never reports because the victims are Black women. The real horror wasn't just the murders. It was how easy it was to get away with them. How easy it was to commit violence against women and never be held accountable. And it is how quickly the names disappeared. This episode is not about solving the case because we can't even agree on who all the victims were, so we are definitely not catching the killer. But it's about a city that looked away, the system that let it happen, and the women whose lives were treated like footnotes if they were ever written down at all. But we'll meet one of these women. Rosa Trice, a laundress, a wife, a homeowner, a woman whose name survived when many didn't. And we are going to talk about the system. You know, that thing everyone blames when stuff goes wrong. It's like a haunted vending machine spitting out injustice. But here's the truth. The system isn't vague. It's not a ghost. It's people. Real people. People who design it, people who maintain it, and people who benefit from it. This episode is about what happens when those people decide that your life doesn't matter. Now, fair warning, this is not a satisfying story. There is no dramatic arrest, no moment of reckoning. The killer was never caught. The violence never stopped. The system didn't change, and that silence, the lack of a resolution, is part of the point. But we're going to tell the story anyway, because remembering is its own kind of resistance. Because history isn't just about the past. It's about how we got to now and where we might be heading next. So grab your parasol and your walking shoes, friends. Tonight, we are taking the long road home through 1911 Atlanta, where the heat wasn't the only thing making Black women sweat with fear. While an unknown killer was striking fear into the Black population of Atlanta, the rest of the world, circa 1911, was not exactly on pause. So, let's take a spin around the globe. In China, the ancient Qing dynasty officially collapsed, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule. A small group of angry, fed-up citizens and soldiers in Wuchang, which is now part of what we call Wuhan, rose up and the Republic of China was declared by the year's end. This single collapse triggered decades of upheaval, revolution, and a global migration that would literally reshape the world map as we knew it. In Europe, the powder keg that would become World War I was already hissing. Tensions between empires, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Britain, France, were rising like smoke under a closed lid. Everyone was spying, stockpiling, and signing treaties with fingers crossed behind their backs. But on the surface, everything looked calm, polished, civilized. It was very much a there is no war in Boston say kind of moment. Except though, of course, there totally was, you just had to know where to look. Meanwhile, in Belfast, Northern Ireland, which back then was still part of a united Ireland under British rule, the Titanic was getting her final polish, all set to sail straight into history. And an iceberg? Just 1 year later. In 1911, the United States was charging into the future. Planes were popping up in the sky, factories roared, wealth flowed, and cities grew taller every year. But not everyone got to come along for the ride. For most people, progress was just the backdrop to poverty, prejudice, and survival. Working conditions in 1911? Honestly, going with conditions is generous. If you were a factory worker, you probably worked 10 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Your pay was low. There was no health insurance, and if you got hurt, that was a you problem. To make things even better, or worse, the machines could maim you easily. The factory air could poison you, and did. And the fire exits? Locked from the outside, because we cannot have any unauthorized potty breaks. And that was just life for factory workers. The everyday person faced capitalism without a conscience, where labor was cheap and the human lives were even cheaper. And in March 1911, all of that would combust, literally in a fire, at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. The fire lasted less than 20 minutes, but it killed 146 people. The majority of the victims? Young immigrant women, Italian, Jewish, barely out of girlhood. They spent long hours sewing shirtwaists, which, if you are like me and have no idea what that means, those were those popular women blouses in the early 1900s with the white linen and puffy sleeves, and sometimes they had the fancy lace or pleats. And all of that was meant to be tucked into a skirt. But here's the thing. That fire sparked outrage. People marched, laws changed. That tragedy turned into reform. So hold on to that. Hold on to that image of the world spinning forward, of some tragedies igniting movements and making the world safer for everyone, while others were simultaneously being buried. Because while the Titanic builders hammered rivets in Belfast and the revolutionaries revolutioned in China, Black women like Rosa Trice walked home in the dark in Atlanta, praying that they would make it to their doors alive. And the world barely noticed. Atlanta, Georgia is located in the southern United States. It's the state capital, but long before it was crowned with that title, long before it became the urban giant that we know today, this land was home to the Muskogee. The Muskogee people are often called Creek by white settlers who, in true colonial fashion, couldn't be bothered to learn their actual name. For centuries, the Muskogee lived here, on the lands they farmed, fished, hunted, and held sacred. This wasn't just territory, it was ancestral ground, bound to their identity, their culture, and their survival. But as white settlers pushed deeper into Georgia, greed and expansion took over. The U.S. government forced Native nations to sign treaties, official documents that were supposed to set fair terms between governments. Unfortunately, these treaties were often more about giving the U.S. a legal cover to take what it wanted while pretending it was all done properly. In reality, these agreements were often forced under threat, manipulated, or signed under crushing pressure. And even then, white officials broke them repeatedly, reshaped and rewrote the rules whenever it suited their expansion plans. Promises made to Native nations were routinely betrayed. Then, in the 1830s, the U.S. government sealed this violent project with the Indian Removal Act. Federal troops and state militia rounded up thousands of Native families at gunpoint, burned their homes and fields, and forced them to march west in what we now call the Trail of Tears. Along the way, entire communities, men, women, children, were punished not for any crime, but for simply existing on the land that white settlers wanted. Thousands died. It was deliberate, brutal displacement, clearing the way for white settlers hungry for land, power, and profit. And let's be real, calling it a removal hides the truth. This was a genocide. A systematic theft, terror, and deliberate destruction of entire nations. It wasn't about the actions of just a few settlers. It was about an entire system that rewarded greed, conquest, and betrayal, no matter the human cost. By the mid-1800s, the settlement built on the land where the Muskogee had been violently displaced was called Terminus, literally the end of the line, because it marked where the Western and Atlantic Railroad would link Georgia's interior to other major rail networks across the South and beyond. A few years later, it was renamed to Marthasville after a politician's daughter, before finally becoming Atlanta in 1847, a name meant to signal grand ambitions connecting the Atlantic coast to the Pacific by rail. Yep, you heard me right. 3 names in under 10 years. Talk about a rebranding frenzy. Atlanta didn't rise on rich farmland or easy ground. It sits on rolling hills, at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. You know, that long mountain range in the United States that stretches from Georgia all the way up to Canada. Atlanta is actually one of the highest major cities in the eastern U.S., sitting pretty at more than 1,050 feet or 320 meters above sea level. Not exactly the easiest place to lay track. But here's the thing. Geography is not just about smooth ground, it's about location, location, location. Atlanta's tough hills sat at the perfect crossing for multiple major railroads. It's where the Western Atlantic, Georgia, Bygone, and Western railroads could all meet and connect the South's interior to the cities beyond. Sure, building there was a challenge, but the payoff was massive. Whoever controlled this rail junction controlled a key piece of the South's economic future. In the mid-1800s, Atlanta was just a few miles across, a scrappy little rail town. But it was growing. By 1911, the time of our story, it had stretched to about 12 square miles, or about 31 square kilometers. It hadn't yet become the sprawling giant that we know it as today, but by the mid-1800s, it was well on its way. And what do you think fueled that growth, that trade, that speed? Slavery. Because let's be honest, when people in power want to get rich fast, they often don't choose fairness, they choose exploitation. Not because it's the only path, or because it's the right path, but because to them, it is the easiest and most profitable. And I mean, why should they care? If the system is built to reward greed, they don't have to care, unless something or someone forces them to. The U.S. banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. So no more raiding villages, chaining people at gunpoint, and shipping them across the Atlantic. But make no mistake, slavery was still very legal. The government basically said, you can still own other humans, just don't go full pirate about it anymore. But we all know that greed doesn't stop just because laws change. That would be too much like rape. In 1860, literally 1 year before the Civil War broke out, the last known illegal slave ship, the Clotilda, smuggled African men, women, and children into the United States. These were people who were free in Africa. They were violently abducted, trafficked, and forced into enslavement in America. Also, white smugglers could cash in on human bodies. By the time the Civil War broke out, enslaved people made up about 20% of Atlanta's population, nearly 2,000 black men, women, and children. They weren't the recent arrivals from Africa like those in the Clotilda. They were born into slavery in the United States. The descendants of people violently taken across the Atlantic generations earlier. Their unpaid forced labor powered Atlanta's warehouses, railroads, factories, construction sites, and the homes of the wealthy. Atlanta's deep investment in slavery made it a crucial Confederate supply hub, which is exactly why, in 1864, the Union Army controversially burned the city to the ground. But here's where the city's myth-making kicks in. After the ashes cooled, Atlanta rebranded itself not as ruined, but as reborn, the Phoenix City. In the years that followed, during a period known as Reconstruction, the federal government, led by Northern politicians, tried to rebuild the South. But it wasn't just about repairing roads and railways. It was about reshaping the social order, about protecting the rights of newly freed Black Americans and redefining what citizenship meant in a country built on slavery. It was radical, it was hopeful, and it was ultimately abandoned. Why? Because the North stopped caring. And yes, I chose those words carefully. They stopped caring. Exhaustion, racism, political deals, and profit went out. Reconstruction quickly proved to be difficult and costly, and Northern leaders really were just ready to move on. They wanted to secure business interests, national security, and political calm. Fighting for Black rights in the South, that was not part of the long-term game plan, because it was not profitable. Because remember, the North was racist too, and the system, then and now, is designed to reward greed. So when Reconstruction became inconvenient, Northern leaders walked away. They made peace with the South by abandoning the very people they promised to protect. And in that silence, something cruel took root. Jim Crow wasn't a new system, it was a recycled one, a resurrection. Slavery patched up and updated. If slavery was version 1.0, then Jim Crow was the upgrade that nobody asked for. Just as violent, just as unjust, but now dressed in the language of law and order. Jim Crow laws emerged after Reconstruction failed, codifying segregation and pushing Black families to the margins. Black Atlantans, however, fought back by building their own thriving neighborhoods, businesses and schools. Morehouse, Spelman, Atlanta University, all these became symbols of Black achievement and Black progress. But white resentment didn't just simmer, it seethed. And in 1906, it exploded. A white mob, fueled by racist headlines and political power plays, tore through downtown Atlanta. They were not protesters. They were not angry citizens. They were violent extremists, and they came prepared to murder. They hunted Black men and boys in the streets. They looted Black-owned businesses. They set homes on fire. They beat women in front of their children. They dragged people out of streetcars and bashed their skulls in just to prove that they could. But the newspapers, they called it a race riot. Because when certain people commit mass violence, the press softens it. It always has. If the script had been reversed, if Black Atlantans had come to do what these white citizens had done, it would have been called an uprising, an insurrection, maybe even a war. But because it was white mobs spilling blood, it got rebranded a riot. As if it was spontaneous, chaotic, totally out of character. It wasn't. It was organized, it was encouraged, and it was a message. You are not safe here, you never were, and you are not equal. So let's call it what it was, not a riot, a massacre, a warning. By 1911, that trauma was still fresh. Black Atlantans lived in a city where the promise of success was shadowed by the constant threat of violence. A place where your degree or your business or your hard work would not protect you against the lash of Jim Crow, where the police weren't your protectors, where your survival depended on your wits, your community, and a whole lot of prayer. And this brings us to Pittsburgh, the neighborhood where Rosa lived. Pittsburgh was a working-class neighborhood, shaped by freed men and laborers after the Civil War. It stood pressed literally against the Atlantic and West Point railroad tracks, steel veins of commerce that cut through the city, powered by black labor but built for white wealth. The trains roared past homes that they never stopped for, even though these were the very people who kept them running. Here, men worked as porters, factory hands, and rail workers. Women, like Rosa, often worked as laundresses, maids, or domestic workers, sometimes taking in extra washing just to make ends meet. These were hard, back-breaking jobs, built the heartbeat of the community. Rosa lived here with her family in this neighborhood and on these streets. She walked the same dusty roads, heard the same trains rattling by, felt the same summer heat pressing against her skin. And when the murders began, it was here, in the places that she knew, that the dread took hold. By the time her name appeared in the headlines, she was not the first. She would not be the last. She was one among many. And still, the city's leaders, the people with the power to act, did nothing. Let me tell you about a house. Not a mansion, not a museum, just a narrow L-shaped wood frame house that stood at 76 Gardner Street Southwest in Atlanta. Tucked up against the railroad tracks, where the walls probably shook every time the train passed, and stood sat on the porch like dust, where sleep had to compete with steel on steel. It wasn't fancy, but it was owned by a black family in post-slavery Atlanta, and that means something. The first name tied to the property where this home stood was John Trice. Born sometime between 1830 and 1840, he was almost certainly enslaved, and yet by the 1880s, he appears in the Freedman's Tax Digest as a landowner, not a renter, not a mortgage, not a dependent. The property he owned was 1/8 of an acre, and it covered 2 lots, 76 and 77 Gardner Street, which was a pretty decent size for a working family. Let me say that again in case you misheard me. A man who was once owned, now owned land in Atlanta, in the Deep South, decades after slavery ended. And that was not just survival, that is legacy. He had at least one son, John Trice Jr., likely born enslaved too, but freed in childhood. I couldn't find anything on his mother, and he may have been the only surviving child, but I found him reading and writing and working steadily and appearing in nearly every city directory from the 1890s to 1912. Always listed at Gardner Street, same address, same house, sometimes even working alongside his father on the very same railroad tracks that ran beside their home. In October 1900, John Jr. married a black woman named Rosa Cooper. I believe I found her in Jefferson County in 1880. She was 19 years old then and listed as the daughter of Willis and Kate Cooper. The oldest of several siblings, she couldn't read or write, but I imagine she had big sister energy. The kind that cooks when mama's tired and wrangles the younger kids, who helps with farm chores and just keeps things going around the home. The kind of girl who grows up fast because she has to. But in the 1870 census, Rosa's missing. The children who came after her are there, but she's not. And that says a lot. Maybe she was working already. She would have been 9 around the time. Maybe she was sent to live with relatives. Or maybe they just didn't care enough to count her. By 1900, Rosa was in Atlanta. Married, close to 40. John Jr. was in his 40s too. And this wasn't a starry-eyed teenage love story. This was 2 grown people choosing each other in the middle of a hard life. Maybe it was love, maybe it was stability, but whatever it was, they built something real together. They made their home at 76 Gardner. It was modest. There was no sewer system, no paved streets, no streetlights, no sidewalk, but it did have piped-in water, which I thought was pretty cool. There was a porch, probably a backyard lined for drying clothes, maybe chickens in a chicken coop, and it sat isolated from the denser blocks nearby. Their street was quiet, minus the trains, but that home was theirs. And Rosa, she worked as a laundress. And let me pause right there because that job, it is not just washing clothes. Because remember, this is a time before washing machines. So this meant hauling water by bucket, boiling over fire in a black iron pot, scrubbing on a washboard until your hands cracked, then starching and pressing every shirt and skirt and everything else with a cast iron that probably weighed more than a newborn. It meant doing all of that for other people while your own laundry piled up. And that's what Rosa did, likely for white families who paid for her services. In the 1910 census, it says that she had one child, but that child had died. No name, no record, just this haunting line, children born 1, living 0. We'll never know if that child was John's or from before. We'll never know if they died in infancy or after a few sweet years. We'll never know where that grief lived in Rosa's body. But I know it was there, and I believe that household it too. By 1910, John Sr. disappears from the record. Maybe he died, maybe he slipped out of the paperwork. But I like to think that he passed in that house, hearing the trains, watching his porch, knowing what he had built. And maybe for the first time since slavery, he got to do what had been stolen from generations of Black families. Pass something down. Not just a house, but a legacy, a place, a proof that he had been here and that his family had a right to stay. I studied that neighborhood. In 1910, only 3 families in that immediately surrounding area owned their own homes. Everybody else rented or mortgaged or boarded. The Trices owned theirs outright. Their neighbors were Black laborers, rail workers, laundresses, just like Rosa. There was a widow with daughters a few houses down, an unmarried carpenter, a physician a few streets over. It was not a wealthy neighborhood, but it was strong. Pittsburgh was one of the few places in Atlanta where Black families could build a life with even a sliver of security. The house on Gardner was just a few blocks from McDaniel Street, a vital artery in Atlanta's early Black neighborhoods. It was one of the first areas in the city with electric streetcars. And if you squint, you can kind of imagine that hope Rosa probably had. Electricity was creeping closer. Paved roads were on the horizon. Like, there was probably dreams of permanence, of progress. And I also wonder, did the 1906 race massacre scar Rosa and John? Were they hiding inside their home while white mobs stormed the city? Did they lose friends, neighbors? Did they survive something unspeakable just to be erased in another way? Maybe they held on tighter to what they had after that, their home, their routines, each other. Maybe surviving that kind of terror made the everyday feel sacred, or maybe it just made it heavier. And then 5 years later, something shifts. In 1911, Rosa is listed in the directory, alone, running her laundry business. John is not listed at all. A John Trice had been listed every year since the 1890s at 76 Garden Street. And suddenly, that name is completely gone. And we don't know why. Was he injured? Was he sick? Was he out of town? Or was this the beginning of something else? We may never know what happened to John that winter, but we do know what happened to Rosa. I imagine that Saturday night, January 21st, 1911, was cold for Atlanta. The kind of way that crept under the doors and clung to the back of your throat. Rosa may have stoked the fire. Maybe she was finishing up laundry or getting ready for church the next morning. Maybe she was folding sheets by the stove, her hands still red from lye and hot water. Or maybe she was just getting ready to leave. The newspaper doesn't say where she may have been going, just where she ended up. Early the next morning, Sunday, January 22nd, her body was found, about 75 yards from her home on Gardner Street, near the tracks that shaped her life the past 9 years. Her skull was crushed, her jaw had been stabbed, her throat was cut, and she had been dragged through the dirt, through the cold, through whatever dignity she had left. And every newspaper said that she was about 35. But Rosa, according to the 1910 sentence, was 50 years old. She had been born into slavery and gained her freedom, seen the Civil War end, and with it, a brief promise. Black men could vote, Black families could legally marry, citizenship was guaranteed, and education became possible. She survived Reconstruction and watched everything the war promised get clawed back. She got married to a man whose family owned their own home, a rare kind of security for Black families in the South. And she hadn't lost a child. She survived the Atlanta race massacre. She worked as a laundress, hard enough, profitably enough, to make it into the city directory on her own. And she died just steps from her home, alone. And she had been laying there for hours. That very same day, the city held a coroner's inquest. Which, side note, the coroner was legally blind, which honestly, initially, I was very alarmed by that. But it turns out I had confused coroner, the person who legally investigates the death, with medical examiner, the one who actually examines the body. Just one of those weird, little history facts that you don't expect to stumble across while you're researching the murder. Anyway, the coroner's verdict. Death by violence. That's it. Her husband, John Trice, was arrested, and I mean, honestly, that makes sense. If true crime podcasts have taught me anything, it's that it's usually the spouse, right? He was taken from their home, questioned, locked up. And I wonder what was that like? Because this is still deep in the Jim Crow era. Atlanta did not have a single black police officer until 1948. So who questioned him? Who held him in that cell? And how did they treat him, a black man whose wife had just been violently murdered? We'll never know. No weapon was recovered. No suspect was charged. No deeper investigation occurred. The connection that this could be part of something bigger, like someone targeting black women specifically, didn't occur until later that summer, after several more women had already been murdered in the same manner. But for John back in January, there was no evidence to hold him until they released him shortly after. And then John went back home, back to the house where Rosa was murdered, where her body had been dragged just feet from the porch. And he kept living there. Did people think he did it? Did he think people thought he did it? Was he innocent, guilty, grieving, broken? Was it hard for him to sleep in that house now, all alone? I don't know. John's name appears one final time in the city directory in 1912, still at 76 Gardner. Listed only as laborer now. No job title, no official company he works for, no clarity. But he's still there. And then he disappears. No more listings. No death record I could find for him, for Rosa, for his father. I don't even know where they're buried. There's just this absence. And I'll be honest, when I saw that by 1914 another family was living at 76 Gardner, I had big feelings. Like, excuse me, I don't know you, but you are not related to John. You don't even know the Trice family, and that was their home. Like, who do you think you are? Who said you could live here? And I don't know these people. I'm not, like, related to them or anything. I'm just like, this was theirs. Who are you? But they were there. And my research after this point is a lot less thorough because I had to stop at one point and just get the episode out. But from what I can tell, in 1914, a man named Frank Johnson, a black barber, is in the city directory living at 76 Gardner. And also another Johnson, Joseph, a carpenter, and his wife Hattie, a laundress, are listed next door at 77 Gardner. 77 Gardner had not appeared before on the directory, so that was new for me. But it's these two addresses, both on the land that belonged to the Trices for decades. But the Johnsons don't stay there long either. By 1916, 77 and 76 Gardner Street vanish. Gone from the directory, gone from the map. And when aerial photography finally captured that part of Atlanta in 1938, it's empty. That house is gone, the lot is bare, the ground where Rosa walked, where she worked, the home that John Sr. built, the space where a child was mourned and a marriage was lived and a woman murdered, erased. What happened to 76 Gardner Street? It was taken by the railroad. There is no plaque, no marker, no memory, no one watching. Except me. And now you. I set out to tell the story of the Atlanta Ripper murder victims. I wanted to name every woman, and I think there were a couple girls too. I wanted to trace their death, show the pattern, find their final resting places so that they could be mourned. Gone but not forgotten. I know that was way too ambitious, so I stepped back. I started with Rosa Trice because my initial research incorrectly listed her as the first victim. And her story has never really been told, not fully, not with care. It's so frustrating because it's just a few lines in a newspaper article and none of them get her age right. Or maybe they do. How do I know if I'm supposed to trust the newspaper or the census when I know I can't really trust either? And y'all know me, I'm not a historian, I am not a genealogist, I am just doing this for funsies. But I promise I tried. I tried to trace the fragments, the census lines, the newspaper clippings, tax records, city directories. I tried to imagine not just how she died, but how she lived, who she was as a person, a whole person, not just the two lines that the newspaper gives us. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the act of trying, of remembering, matters. Maybe Rosa is where we begin. Because what started as this list of victims unraveled into something much messier. Names changed spellings. People appeared and disappeared and reappeared. They resurfaced without clarity. Some were never named at all. There are so many Jane Does that it is unsettling. And so the deeper I looked, the more uncertain it became. Were there only 10 victims? Or 24, maybe 28? Did it start in 1906? Did it stretch all the way until the 1930s? We don't know. And we probably never will. And that's the tragedy. That's the failure. These were people, fellow humans, black women, working class women, domestic workers, laundresses, maids, walking home after long days of cleaning up somebody else's life, and they were stalked. Their skulls were crushed, their throats were cut, their shoes were sometimes taken, and their bodies were discarded like trash. Some even died from gunshot wounds, some from strangulation, and it is too many to even count. And the world, the United States, even the city of Atlanta barely blinked. Black churches tried to raise awareness, the Black community and a few white sympathizers, because apparently you needed that to legitimize your concern, tried to protect these women. But what can you do when Jim Crow is law? There were barely any headlines, no outrage, just spectacle, no serious investigation, and no justice. Some of the victims were even blamed for their own deaths. Some were brushed off as just victims of domestic violence. Some were never recorded at all, their bodies never discovered. I wanted to say every name. I wanted to give each woman the dignity and memory and humanity that they deserve. But the record keeping? It is chaos, to put it nicely. And I'm just one person sifting through the fragments trying to make sense of what was never meant to be preserved. So this time, I am choosing to remember Rosa. I will put a list of possible victims on the website along with sources in case anyone else wants to pick up where I left off, or if you're just curious about the chaos that I've been swimming in the past month and a half. Because these women mattered. Because Rosa's life, not just her death, showed me everything I didn't even want to understand about the situation. And about how the system allowed these murders to happen and to remain unsolved. About how historic Black neighborhoods get erased, and about what it meant to be a Black woman in Jim Crow South. And about how the system and the people who uphold it decide which history matters and which history disappears. Because remember, kids, the system isn't some nameless, faceless beast, it's people. Real people. People who design it, people who maintain it, people who benefit from it. It is a human creation, and that means that it can be changed. We just have to decide it matters enough to try. We talked about 76 Gardner Street, Rosa's home. The house she shared with her husband, John. The house she died just steps from. And how, after 1915, it vanishes from the city directory. I found out that the streets were renumbered in the 1920s, and so I thought maybe that was the issue, that's why I can't find her home. But no, I firmly believe that it was taken by the railroad that it sat beside, quietly and legally. So I have been reading legal cases lately, against my will, thank you very much. But that is an entire other saga that I do not want to drag you into. But in the middle of that rabbit hole, I stumbled upon a case from 1903. Gardner versus Georgia Railroad and Banking Company. And for a second I froze. I was like, Gardner? Could this be it? This is Rosa Street. I got so insanely excited. But it was not. It was just a coincidence. Because honestly, the case name should have given it away. But anyway, the ruling stuck with me. Because what that case did say was that railroads had the right to condemn land, which basically means they can legally take your privately owned property, not just once, but over and over every time they decided it was necessary. Sidetracks, terminals, expansion. If they wanted your land, they could legally take it, especially if you were Black, especially if you were poor. You had no real power to stop them. And fun fact, railroads in the United States never really lost that power. They can still condemn your land if they claim that it serves the public good. And sure, you can fight back, but if the court sides with the railroad, then you are probably out of luck. Rosa and John's house literally sat beside the railroad tracks. I saw it on a 1911 Sanborn insurance map, which, side note, early 1900 insurance maps, oh my goodness, obscure, nerdy magic that feeds my soul. Shout out to those little hand-drawn porches and outhouses, I freaking love you. But later insurance maps, harder to find and sadly not digitized. And Atlanta won't give me a library card because apparently living several states away makes me unworthy. And I'm too stubborn to ask. I'm sure I could find the process to get one, but I am just at capacity. So I turned to aerial photography, and by 1938, the first year those photos existed that I could find online for free, that house was already gone. The whole lot looks bare. The land wasn't forgotten though. It was cleared, it was taken, and the railroad just kept growing. By the 1970s, it expanded again, pushing deeper into the Pittsburgh neighborhood, quietly eating it away, block by block. There was no fire, no headline, just legal paperwork, just condemnation rights doing exactly what they're designed to do. Hey, y'all, I'm actually editing it right now, and the Pittsburgh neighborhood still exists. So don't get me wrong, it's still there. The train tracks just cut into it a whole lot in the 1970s. Okay, back to your regularly scheduled show. So no, Rosa and John didn't just lose their home, it was erased. By design. And when I realized that I had been staring at this empty lot on Google Maps, thinking that I had found 76 Gardner Street only to see that it has lived under the railroad tracks since about the 1930s, that hit me hard, because John Trice Sr. was born into slavery and he owned that land. He bought that land and he built a home and he built a life and he passed it on to his son. And now that piece of history is buried beneath steel and gravel. And it was erased like it never mattered. And if I'm wrong, oh my goodness, I am hoping that I am wrong. I want to be wrong. I want it to be that I misread or misinterpreted something, and I would love for someone, a professional historian, a genealogist, a local expert, or somebody who just has the time and access to the records that I couldn't get to prove me wrong. Please prove me wrong. Please tell me that Rosa lived longer and that she has a grave that we can visit if we want to, and that John's name reappears, and that the house on 76 Gardner Street actually stood for decades and I just missed it. Because if what I've found is true, if Rosa's life was erased, her body brutalized, and her home quietly swallowed by the railroad, then this isn't just history. This is a blueprint. And that breaks me. That hurts. The rail yard where John and his father worked, just steps from Rosa's kitchen, still stands. It's old and weathered and rusted, but it's still there. I'm pretty sure it's still in operation. And there's a giant word painted on one of the buildings. Terminus. And that's when it hit me. Like, I know that name. Where do I know that name from? The Walking Dead. Yep, that season. Early in the show, Rick and gang's wild shenanigans lead them to a rail yard that promises sanctuary but delivers terror. And of course, zombies. Don't worry, I won't spoil the episode for you. And painted on one of the buildings in the rail yard is the word terminus. And the tracks, they're a trap. And those episodes, they were filmed right next to where Rosa Trice called home, where her home is now buried beneath those same tracks where she was violently murdered. And it makes me wonder how many other stories are just buried like that. Think about it. Everybody knows Jack the Ripper. Hell, the name Atlanta Ripper is based on him. There are museums, walking tours, books, documentaries, novels, podcasts, like there's so many things. Entire industries built around a mystery of a man who killed 5 white women in London in the 1880s. We talked about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory earlier. That tragedy sparked labor reforms, memorials, a national reckoning, and don't get me wrong, they should be remembered. They should all be remembered. Because this isn't a tragedy Olympics. It's not about ranking grief and who had it worse. It's about who we remember and who we let disappear. Here's another contrast. In 1913, just 2 years after Rosa Trice was murdered and forgotten, and while Black women were actively being stalked and killed in Atlanta by the Atlanta Ripper, the city of Atlanta erupted over the murder of Mary Fagan, a 13-year-old white child laborer. Her death made national headlines, as it should have. What happened to that child was horrible, and then it just continued to get worse. Leo Frank, a Jewish factory superintendent, was accused of the crime, convicted, and sentenced to die. And here's where justice almost flickered. The evidence used to convict him was absolutely flimsy, and so his sentence was commuted to life in prison. Unfortunately, some white people did not like that. Violent white extremists, including a former governor, a judge, and other prominent white men from the community, stormed the prison, abducted Leo, and lynched him. Then, they had the audacity to pose for photographs beneath his body. You can still search those photographs online today. These men committed an act of terror against someone who was already being punished for a crime that many people then, and nearly all historians now, agree he didn't commit, because Leo's real crime was being Jewish. And anti-Semitism was, and still is, today as you are hearing these words, alive and very well. Mary's case stirred national outrage, but for Black women who were still actively being murdered during this time frame, there was no public mourning, no headlines, no trials, just silence. So you have to ask, why didn't the same urgency exist for Black women in Atlanta? Why do some stories get preserved and others get paved over? We remember a fictional rail yard from a zombie TV show, but not the formerly enslaved man who once owned land there, built a home, passed it on to his son, and that his daughter-in-law was murdered just steps from their porch before the house itself was buried under the tracks. And if that makes you angry, good, it should. Because this isn't just history, this still happens. Neighborhoods like Rosa's, like Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Black neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods are still being erased every single day. Bulldozed for stadiums and highways and luxury condos or urban revitalization. It's called progress, it's called development, but it's the same pattern, repackaged. The same quiet removal, the same shrug. We still live in a country where Black women go missing, get murdered, and barely make the news. There are no manhunts, no major headlines, just grief that never gets a name. And it's not just Black women. Indigenous women have been disappearing and dying for generations. Right now in 2025, families are still pleading for help, for coverage, for somebody to care. Campaigns like MMIW, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, exist because the system still does not care enough to look. Because when the victims sit at the intersection of race and gender and poverty, they are treated like they don't matter. The systems that let the Atlanta Ripper go undetected, they're not gone. They just evolved. We still underfund Black communities. We still neglect public services. We still let certain crimes go unsolved because deep down, this country is sending the same message. Some lives matter more than others. Some deaths get justice, others get silence. So if you're listening and you have feelings, hold on to them. Because Rosa's story is not just about the past, it's about now. It's about who gets remembered and who gets erased. History does not just live in books, it lives in houses and in our neighborhood and in the names that we were never meant to learn or remember. And learning them, saying them, that's how we fight back. That's how we remember, that's how we honor, and that is how we make sure that silence does not win. Because Rosa mattered, and so did every woman who was listed but never lifted. And when we remember them, we say, you were here, you were seen, and you mattered. So, friends, where does that leave us? With a house that no longer stands, with lives we were never meant to learn about, and a silence that was carefully constructed, not accidental. Rosa Trice mattered, and so did every woman whose name did not make it, or did make it, to the headlines, whose life wasn't recorded, whose death was ignored. And when we say their names, when we remember their homes, their stories, when we trace the footsteps they took on those dirt roads, even if all we have is a city directory and a ghost of an address, we are refusing to let them disappear. And that matters. Because the system that let this happen is not ancient history. It is still around. Just polished, repackaged, a little rebranded, and easier to ignore if it doesn't touch you directly. So if this story made you uncomfortable, good. If it made you sad or angry or restless, hold on to that. Use it. Because remembrance is resistance, and curiosity is power. If today's episode stirred something in you, if it made you feel the weight of these forgotten women, don't stop here. You can still help. By learning about the MMIW movement, that's the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, it's a crisis that's still happening today, and awareness of it is just the beginning. Support local and national organizations that search for missing persons, like the Black and Missing Foundation or NAMIS, the National Database for Missing and Unidentified People in the United States, or similar databases in your own country. Because these stories, Rosa's and so many others, aren't just the past, they're patterns. And breaking them starts with caring enough to learn, to notice, and to say that this matters. Thank you for choosing to be here, for listening, for feeling and remembering alongside me. Next time, we will shift gears into something spooky fun, but I don't know what exactly because there are so many spooky fun topics. So I haven't decided which is my favorite yet. Until then, be kind, be curious, and be ready to make history. Interested in learning more? I am actually going to do the section this time around because sadly there are no books that exist that truly center on the Atlanta Ripper victims, their lives, their humanity, or the systems that erase them. But if you are interested in exploring similar themes, we recommend White Rage by Carol Anderson. This book reveals how American policy and backlash have systematically blocked Black progress after every civil rights gain. And The Dead Shall Rise by Steve Oney. A sweeping investigation of the Leo Frank case, his lynching, and it exposes anti-Semitism and the politics behind it. At the End of the Street by Daniel L. McGuire connects the civil rights movement to the long fight against sexual violence towards Black women, starting in the Jim Crow era. And you can visit our website at www.bygoneechoes.website for information, resources, and more.